Picture yourself standing beside a small fire on a bitterly cold night somewhere in Eurasia around 15,000 years ago. The hunt is over. The day's scraps lie scattered near the edge of camp, and beyond the glow of the flames, darkness stretches in every direction. Every sound matters. Every shadow could mean danger. Then, without warning, you hear movement just outside the circle of light. A pair of amber eyes appears, watching silently from the trees. Your hand tightens around your spear. Every instinct tells you this is a wolf, a predator powerful enough to compete with you for food and, under the wrong circumstances, view you as prey. Yet something unexpected happens. The animal doesn't charge, it doesn't retreat. It simply waits, studying you with the same cautious curiosity that you reserve for it. Neither of you knows it, but that quiet standoff may become one of the most important turning points in human history. Today, it's easy to forget how extraordinary dogs really are. They sleep on our couches, greet us at the front door, and somehow convince us that sharing half our dinner is perfectly reasonable. Their loyalty feels so familiar that we rarely stop to ask the obvious question: how did a fierce Ice Age hunter become humanity's closest companion? The answer is far stranger than the story most of us grew up hearing. There was no prehistoric genius who decided to tame wolves one by one until they became pets. In fact, the evidence points towards something far more surprising: a partnership that neither species consciously planned, yet one that transformed both forever. To understand how that happened, we first need to step back into a world long before farms, cities, or even permanent villages existed. Because the first chapter of this story wasn't written by civilization, it began in the harsh landscapes of the Stone Age, where survival itself quietly set the stage for one of evolution's most remarkable alliances. But the story most people know begins very differently. For generations, people have imagined that this partnership began with an act of courage. A hunter discovers a den of wolf pups, takes one home, raises it by hand, and slowly transforms a dangerous predator into a faithful companion. It's a compelling story. It appears in children's books, movies, and even older history texts. The only problem is that modern science suggests it almost certainly didn't happen that way. To understand why, you have to understand what a wolf really is. Gray wolves are not simply wild dogs. They are highly specialized apex predators shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Their social lives revolve around tightly bonded family groups. Their hunting strategies depend on extraordinary cooperation, and their instincts are tuned for surviving environments where even a single mistake can be fatal. Every behavior, from their caution around unfamiliar creatures to their willingness to defend territory, is the product of relentless natural selection. Even today, people who raise wolf pups from birth discover that affection alone doesn't erase those instincts. A hand-raised wolf may learn to recognize its human caretaker, but as it matures, its behavior begins to diverge dramatically from that of a domestic dog. It becomes increasingly independent, intensely territorial, and far less interested in following human social cues. What looks manageable at a few months old often becomes unpredictable as adulthood arrives. Wildlife researchers and sanctuaries have seen this pattern repeatedly, reminding us that taming an individual animal is not the same as changing an entire species. That distinction is crucial because domestication isn't about teaching a wild animal new tricks. It is an evolutionary process that reshapes behavior across countless generations. A wolf can become familiar with humans, but its offspring will still inherit the instincts of wolves unless something changes the forces acting on the population itself. Which brings us back to the real mystery. If humans lacked the ability to simply tame wolves into becoming dogs, then the first step in this remarkable relationship must have happened another way. Instead of asking which humans were brave enough to approach wolves, scientists began asking a far more intriguing question. What if some wolves were the ones that approached us? The answer wasn't a heroic act or a deliberate plan. It came from a subtle shift that neither species could have recognized at the time. It began with an unexpected opportunity created by human survival itself, one that quietly rewarded the boldest, calmest, and most curious wolves long before anyone realized history was changing. It turned out to be surprisingly ordinary. It wasn't a dramatic encounter or a daring act of taming, it was simply what humans left behind after dinner. Imagine the edge of a hunter-gatherer camp at the end of a successful day. A large animal has been butchered, the best cuts have already been eaten, and scattered across the ground are cracked bones, scraps of meat, skin, and organs too difficult or too costly to carry. To us, it looks like waste. To a hungry predator roaming an Ice Age landscape, it is an irresistible opportunity. For wolves, food was never guaranteed. A failed hunt could mean days without eating, and even successful hunts carried enormous risks. Chasing large prey often resulted in broken bones, deep wounds, or exhausted pack members that might never recover. Evolution rewarded wolves that could conserve energy whenever possible. If an easy meal appeared, ignoring it simply wasn't a good survival strategy. Human camps unintentionally created exactly that kind of opportunity. Unlike other predators, humans produced a steady supply of leftovers. As our ancestors became increasingly skilled hunters, they began concentrating food in one location, something almost unheard of in nature. Instead of tracking migrating herds endlessly across the landscape, a wolf could linger near a campsite and occasionally find discarded bones rich with marrow or scraps that required no dangerous chase to obtain. But there was an obvious problem. Those scraps lay dangerously close to the most unpredictable creatures in the environment. Humans carried fire. They hunted cooperatively. They threw spears with remarkable accuracy. They defended one another. For most wolves, approaching a human camp was simply too risky. The safest strategy was to stay well away and search for food elsewhere. Yet, populations are never made up of identical individuals. Just as some people are naturally cautious while others are adventurous, wolves also varied in temperament. A few were slightly less fearful. Some tolerated unfamiliar situations a little longer before fleeing. Others possessed a stronger curiosity that occasionally outweighed their caution. Those tiny differences, almost invisible within a single generation, became enormously important over time. The wolves willing to edge a little closer often gained access to an easy meal. Better nutrition meant healthier adults. Healthier adults raised more pups, and because many behavioral tendencies have a genetic component, those offspring inherited a greater likelihood of tolerating humans themselves. Generation after generation, natural selection quietly favored animals with lower stress responses around people. What's remarkable is that no one was directing this process. The wolves weren't trying to become dogs. Humans weren't trying to create pets. Both species were simply behaving in ways that improved their chances of surviving another winter. Evolution, however, doesn't require intention. It only requires that certain traits consistently lead to greater reproductive success. And over enough generations, those small advantages began producing noticeable changes. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new kind of wolf emerged around human camps. They were still wolves in every biological sense, but they reacted differently. They fled less readily. They observed humans from shorter distances. They spent more time near settlements where food was abundant and competition with more aggressive pack members was often reduced. At first, the relationship was almost certainly one-sided. Humans may have viewed these animals as little more than scavengers lurking beyond the firelight. But familiarity has a powerful effect. When the same cautious wolves appeared night after night without attacking, they gradually became a predictable part of the landscape. Fear didn't disappear overnight, but repeated encounters slowly replaced surprise with recognition. That subtle shift changed everything. Once humans realized these animals weren't simply stealing scraps, but were also chasing away rival predators, alerting camps to approaching danger, and cleaning up discarded remains, tolerance could begin turning into acceptance. Without either species fully understanding what was happening, the distance between hunter and wolf grew a little smaller with every generation. The partnership that would eventually reshape both their futures wasn't born through conquest or control. It emerged because, in one of evolution's most elegant accidents, cooperation proved more valuable than conflict. At this point, the explanation seems almost complete. The friendliest wolves found more food, survived more often, and gradually became less like their wild ancestors. It's an elegant idea, but for a long time scientists struggled with one enormous question. Could selecting for something as simple as reduced fear really transform an entire animal? The answer arrived thousands of years after the first wolves wandered near human camps, thanks to an experiment that had nothing to do with dogs. In the late 1950s, Russian geneticist Dmitry Belyaev set out to test a remarkably simple hypothesis. Instead of studying wolves, he worked with silver foxes raised on fur farms. His breeding program ignored almost every trait that animal breeders normally cared about. He didn't select for size, coat color, strength, or intelligence. He focused on just one characteristic: how calmly a fox reacted to people. Each generation, the least fearful foxes were chosen to become parents. The more aggressive animals were not. At first, the results were exactly what Belyaev expected. The foxes became calmer around people, tolerating human presence and even wagging their tails when caretakers appeared. But after only a handful of generations, something extraordinary happened. The foxes started changing in ways no one had selected for. Their ears became floppy. Their tails curled. White patches appeared in coats that had once been uniformly colored. Their skulls grew shorter and rounder. Their breeding cycles shifted, making them reproduce more like domestic animals than wild ones. Even their vocalizations changed, becoming more varied and surprisingly similar to those of young dogs seeking human attention. None of these traits had been intentionally selected. Choosing only the calmest foxes had triggered a cascade of physical and behavioral changes known today as domestication syndrome. Although scientists are still studying the exact genetics, the leading explanation involves changes to neural crest cells during early embryonic development. These cells influence a remarkable range of features throughout the body, including pigmentation, facial structure, hormone production, cartilage, and parts of the nervous system. Altering the stress response appears to ripple through this entire developmental system, producing changes that seem unrelated at first glance but are deeply connected beneath the surface. Suddenly, the picture became much clearer. The wolves lingering near prehistoric camps didn't need humans to consciously reshape every aspect of their bodies. If natural selection consistently favored the calmest individuals, evolution could do much of the work on its own. Over generations, lower fear levels would not only produce friendlier animals, but also subtly transform their appearance, their development, and eventually the way they communicated. Perhaps the most astonishing lesson from Belyaev's experiment wasn't that animals could change. It was how quickly meaningful change could begin. Evolution is often imagined as an unimaginably slow process measured in millions of years. Yet, under strong and consistent selection, dramatic transformations can emerge within decades. Stretch that process across centuries and millennia around countless hunter-gatherer camps, and the emergence of the earliest dogs no longer seems like an evolutionary miracle. It begins to look like an almost inevitable consequence of two species repeatedly discovering that life was easier together than apart. Evolution had changed the wolves, but eventually, evolution wasn't acting alone. Once humans noticed that some wolves were more useful than others, a new force quietly entered the story: human choice. By this point, the relationship was no longer driven solely by natural selection. The wolves had taken the first steps, but humans gradually began shaping the partnership as well. Not through a grand plan or a sudden decision, but through countless small choices made over generations. Imagine noticing that the same wolf appears near your camp every evening. It never lunges toward your children. It never steals food while you're watching. Instead, it keeps its distance, feeding on discarded bones before disappearing into the darkness. Night after night, its presence becomes familiar rather than alarming. Then one evening, it reacts before you do. Long before your ears detect anything unusual, the wolf stiffens, stares into the darkness, and lets out a sharp bark or growl. Moments later, another predator emerges from the trees. Suddenly, the scavenger you've tolerated has become an early warning system. Experiences like these would have changed human attitudes remarkably quickly. A calm wolf wasn't merely another mouth to feed. It could increase the safety of an entire camp. During the hunts, it might notice prey hidden in thick vegetation. Around sleeping children, it could detect approaching danger before any human senses did. Even cleaning up discarded remains reduced the scent that attracted less welcome scavengers. For the wolves, the benefits were just as significant. Human camps offered reliable food, protection from larger predators, and a relatively stable environment in an unpredictable Ice Age world. Individuals that cooperated with humans often survived better than those relying solely on traditional pack hunting. This is why many researchers describe the process as co-evolution rather than simple domestication. Evolution wasn't occurring on only one side of the relationship. Wolves were adapting to life alongside humans, while humans were gradually adapting their own behavior to make room for these increasingly useful companions. The archaeological and genetic evidence also suggests this partnership may not have happened only once. Instead of a single camp producing the world's first dogs, similar processes may have unfolded independently across different regions of Eurasia. Wherever humans created dependable food sources and certain wolves proved unusually tolerant, evolution had another opportunity to repeat the experiment. By this stage, something even more profound was beginning to emerge. These animals were no longer surviving alongside humans simply because scraps were available. Generation after generation, they were becoming better at understanding us. And in response, humans were beginning to understand them in ways no other wild animal ever inspired, laying the foundation for a bond that would eventually extend far beyond survival. The longer wolves lived alongside humans, the less this relationship resembled a simple alliance between two predators. It began changing something far more fundamental, the way each species understood the other. Over thousands of generations, dogs didn't just become easier to live with. Their minds evolved to operate in ways that remain astonishingly unique in the animal kingdom. One of the clearest examples is something so ordinary that most of us never think about it. Point toward an object, and almost any dog will instinctively follow your finger. It seems trivial, but among animals, this ability is extraordinarily rare. Human infants learn to follow pointing as part of their social development, yet even our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, often struggle to interpret the gesture. Wolves do too. Researchers have raised wolf pups from birth, feeding them by hand, and surrounding them with people from their earliest days. Despite all that effort, adult wolves generally fail to respond to human pointing the way dogs do. A domestic puppy, on the other hand, often understands the gesture with very little experience. This suggests that thousands of years of evolution didn't simply teach dogs to obey humans. They reshaped their brains to interpret our signals almost automatically. The same transformation appears in something even more personal: eye contact. Among wolves, holding another individual's gaze is rarely friendly. A prolonged stare is often a challenge, a warning that conflict may follow. Dogs turned that ancient rule upside down. Instead of avoiding our eyes, they actively seek them out, looking to our faces for information, reassurance, or guidance before making decisions. Even more remarkable is what happens inside our bodies during these moments. When a dog and its owner share relaxed eye contact, both experience a rise in oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone. The same chemical strengthens the connection between parents and their infants, reinforcing trust, affection, and caregiving. In effect, evolution transformed a predator that once viewed humans with suspicion into an animal capable of forming one of the deepest social bonds found between different species. Natural selection even left its mark on the dog's face itself. Compared with wolves, domestic dogs possess subtle facial muscles that allow them to raise their inner eyebrows, creating the familiar expression many owners instantly recognize. Those wide, pleading eyes make the face appear younger, softer, and more vulnerable. Whether asking for food or simply watching you eat dinner, the effect is almost impossible to ignore. It is tempting to think of that expression as clever manipulation, but it is better understood as another chapter in a shared evolutionary story. Humans consistently responded more positively to animals that communicated clearly with them, while dogs that excelled at attracting human attention enjoyed better care and greater chances of survival. Over countless generations, both species unknowingly reinforced the same behaviors. By now, the partnership had become far more than practical cooperation. Humans were no longer keeping these animals simply because they were useful, and dogs were no longer lingering near camps merely because scraps were available. An emotional connection had taken root, one strong enough to outlast changing climates, migrating peoples, and eventually the rise of civilization itself. As human societies became more complex, so did the roles dogs played within them. Some were bred to track game across vast landscapes. Others learned to guard camps, herd livestock, pull sleds through frozen wilderness, or stand watch while their human families slept. Over thousands of years, selective breeding amplified traits that had once existed only as subtle differences among early dogs, producing an astonishing variety of shapes, sizes, and behaviors. The diversity we see today is almost impossible to find elsewhere in the animal kingdom. From towering Great Danes to tiny Chihuahuas, from lightning-fast greyhounds to powerful mastiffs, every breed traces its ancestry back to those early wolves that first tolerated life alongside humans. Although most modern breeds were established only within the last few centuries, the foundation for all of them was laid long before the first city was ever built. Yet perhaps the greatest legacy of domestication isn't physical at all. It is the extraordinary relationship that developed between two species that once competed for survival. What began as cautious coexistence around scattered campfires evolved into a partnership built on trust, communication, and mutual dependence. One so successful that it has endured through every chapter of human history. In the end, the story of dogs is not really about domestication. It's about two intelligent species discovering, one cautious step at a time, that cooperation offered a better path than competition. Neither wolves nor humans could have imagined where that first encounter beside an Ice Age campfire would eventually lead. There was no master plan, no deliberate attempt to reshape evolution. There were only countless small advantages that accumulated across thousands of generations until an ancient predator became something entirely new. That transformation changed far more than the wolves themselves. Dogs helped humans hunt more efficiently, detect danger sooner, and expand into environments that might otherwise have been far more difficult to survive. In return, humans provided food, protection, and a place within their growing communities. Each species influenced the evolution of the other, creating one of the longest and most successful partnerships in natural history. The next time a dog greets you with unstoppable excitement, rests quietly at your feet, or looks into your eyes as though it understands exactly how you're feeling, remember that you're witnessing the result of a relationship that began over 15,000 years ago. A single cautious approach toward a distant campfire grew into a bond that has survived the rise and fall of civilizations, and remains one of evolution's most extraordinary achievements.